Hello! So the goal of the tutorial is to use avatar dynamics to directly grab your items instead of toggling them with a menu. Little disclaimer, this is an updated version of my old tutorial about contacts, because I learned a few little things since then that actually solve almost all the synchronization problems I previously had. If you already watched the first tutorial I made, skip directly to the chapter called Introduction to the Animator. That's where the new stuff is. All the Timecodes are in the description. Be sure to get the latest version of the VRChat SDK, and let's start! The first steps will be creating the different parent constraints and animations that will change the position of the weapon. If you already know how to do that, you can go directly to the second up the PhysBone chapter. The very first step will be to create an empty object inside your avatar. That's where we'll put the weapon. I will name it items. Here I'm going to create a world constraint, but if you don't want or don't need it, you can skip directly to creating the standard parent constraints chapter. Okay, so we'll start by creating a world constraint. That's the stuff that allows us to leave items in the world. To do that, first create an empty object in the scene, not inside your avatar, directly on the scene. Now drag and drop that object to your assets. That will create a prefab. When the prefab is created, delete the object from the scene. For the sake of clarity, I will rename that prefab world constraint. Now add a parent constraint to our items object. Add a source and drag and drop the world constraint into it. Now press the Activate button of the parent constraint. The world constraint has been created, so now we'll take care of the normal parent constraint. First of all, place your weapon inside the items object we created at the beginning. For this tutorial, the weapon will just be a default Unity cylinder. We'll also need movable containers for each destination. We'll start by creating the hip one. For that, we just create an empty element inside it and rename it to whatever we want. Do the same thing for the left and right wrists. Now, zero out the weapon position and let's create a parent constraint in that weapon. We'll need three sources. 2 for the hands and 1 for the hip. So already create them and put their weight to 0. Now drag and drop the 3 containers we just created into the 2 slots and activate the parent constraint with the activate button. Do not check the activate checkbox yourself. Before going further, I will assign a random texture to the cylinder to know its orientation when positioning it. Except if you plan to add a cylinder to your avatar, it's not a problem you should encounter. Okay, let's start by defining how the weapon should be positioned when in the hip. For that, we just put the weight of the parent source related to the hip to 1. As you can see, the weapon moved. It's because it's now parented to that container. To adjust the weapon position, it is very important and actually mandatory that you do not move the weapon itself, you move the corresponding container. So in that case, the hip container. Okay, now that our weapon fits right inside the hip, we can work on the next parent source. Using the exact same technique, put the hip container weight back to 0 and the one you want to adjust to 1. And then adjust the position by manipulating the container. The exact same thing will be done for the left hand. I've sped up that part a bit until all 3 sources and containers are okay. Okay, now all our sources are set up, so we can check if everything is alright by playing with the weight to switch the active one. If there is a problem there, you may have missed a step, so go back and check if everything is okay. Also, note that if you use a world constraint and disable the parent constraint on the item, the weapon should stay where it is when you move the avatar. Since everything is okay here, I'll put the weapon back into the hip position by putting its weight to 1. Also be sure to never have more than one source with a weight of 1 at a time, or you will get weight results with the weapon being in between the 2 sources. Let's now create the animations. For that, we will duplicate our avatar with Ctrl D. So let's go to the animation tab and let's create one with the create button. The first one will be to grab the weapon with the right hand. So name it as you wish. I will name it weapon right. That animation will do 4 things. Activate the weapon parent constraint, put the weight of the right hand container to 1, put the weight of the left hand to 0, put the weight of the hip to 0. Basically, the left hand and the hip animation will do the exact same thing, just putting another weight to 1 and the others to 0. So I will speed up that part a little. Note that all 3 parent sources have their proper animation. We need a special one for putting the weapon in the world. Of course, if you didn't create a world constraint, you can already skip to the next chapter. This one is actually pretty easy, and all it does is disabling the weapon parent constraint. We now have all of our animations, so let's delete the clone and let's get started with the avatar dynamics part. Okay. So, we now have completely finished the constraint setup and its animation. This is the moment of the video when people who already know everything about parent constraints have joined us. So, as a quick wrap up, we've created a world constraint and put the weapon inside. It also has a parent constraint with 3 sources, 2 for the hands and 1 for the hip. We also created all the animations that will change the weapon location between all 2 sources. Now we're starting the avatar dynamics part, and we will start by creating the PhysBone that will allow us to grab the item. So first of all, we'll create an empty object inside the weapon. This will be the grabbable part. So I will just call it grab. We will add a VRC PhysBone to that object and set immobile to 1, because we don't want it to act like a standard PhysBone. We now need to create an offset and move the element so the PhysBone will cover the part that we want to grab. The PhysBone is represented by that thin white line you can see on the cylinder. When it's done, don't forget to uncheck auto collision and also auto posing, and slide grab movement all the way up to 1. I'm honestly not sure this is mandatory, but I've always did it, so I will continue to do it. Next step is to make the PhysBone bigger so you can grab it more easily. For that, just change the radius to whatever size fits you. When it's done, we arrive at a very important part, because we need to fill the parameter field. It will generate plenty of useful parameters for us in the animator layers. The underscore isGrabbed parameter is the one we will be using. For simplicity's sake, I will just call it weapon. And that's all for the PhysBones for now. The PhysBone and its parameter are ready, but we still need to add some VRChat magic to that weapon. The weapon needs to know which hand is grabbing it, and also if it's in the hip or in the world. And for that, we're gonna use senders and receivers. I know that you could totally add the receiver components to the grab object we just used, or even to the weapon itself, but I like to separate stuff into distinct objects. But feel free to do it your favorite way. So I will now create another empty object inside the weapon, and this one will be for the left hand, so we'll call it receiver L. And we will add to that object a VRC contact receiver. It's that big blue sphere that appeared on the scene. Of course we're going to resize it. The goal of that component is simply to detect our left hand. Like we did with the PhysBone earlier, we will now adjust the size, shape and position to fit our needs. Okay. So, the receiver is now positioned correctly, and all it needs now is a collision tag and the parameter. VRChat has built-in tags and senders for everything hand related, so we just add hand L. When the hand will collide with our receiver, the specified parameter will be set to 1, 0 otherwise. We just need to name it. This one will be called weapon left. For the right hand, we just have to duplicate the object we just worked on. For that, select it and press Ctrl D. Let's rename it receiver R and replace all left hand references by the right hand ones. Last thing, don't forget to uncheck allow others on both receivers. Okay, now the weapon is ready to be grabbed by our hands, but we still need to be able to put it back inside the hip. And for that, we need an additional receiver. When resizing and positioning this one, keep in mind that its goal is not to detect your hands, but a sender that we will put on the hip later. For swords, I usually put it around the hilt, but do whatever you feel is right. The tag we're going to use isn't a built-in one, so we have to give it a name. Don't forget that name, because you will have to type the exact same one in the contact sender. Also, don't forget to type in a parameter name. Now, the only thing we need to add to our hierarchy is the contact sender for the hip. So, select it, the hip I mean, create an empty element inside, and add a VRC contact sender to that element. Resize and move the sender so that when the weapon is stored inside the hip, sender and receivers are in contact with each other. Now add a custom tag to the sender with the exact same name you used as a custom tag for the receiver. Okay, for those who watched the first version of that tutorial, the new stuff starts here. Now everything is set up in our scene, We'll now start the most important step, which will contain all the intelligence of the system, the animator part. I will start with a little introduction to what we're gonna do here, and then I will of course explain each part in detail. If you're not interested by the logic behind it and just want to follow the steps, feel free to skip to the next chapter. As you saw, we created a bunch of parameters for PhysBone on our receivers, and of course we're going to use them in the animation layers. However, if we drive the location of the item directly with those parameters, it will create synchronization problem with our players. If for any reason another player don't get notified about one of those parameters by the game, the item won't be in the same location for them than for you. It will always happen to players that join the world after you grabbed an item, and sometimes when people are not close to you at the exact moment you grab it. But the SDK actually has tools that will allow us to force the sync of almost everything. There will still be problems with the word constraint for late joiners, but those are unavoidable and will happen even with toggle menu. What the SDK offers is called Avatar Parameter Driver, and it's a behavior that allows an animator layer to change the value of an expression parameter. It's not a new thing at all, but I just didn't know about it when I created the first tutorial. So sorry about that. The expression parameters are always synced up with our players, so we'll use those ones to drive the location of our items, and we will change the expression parameter values with the parameters we created earlier. That may sound a little complicated, but we will do it step by step, and it's not as difficult as it sounds. Okay, at first we'll create a new expression parameter. That will be the one which will drive the item's location. If you don't have a custom VRC expression parameter yet, create one in your assets by right-clicking and affect it to the expression parameter slot in your avatar descriptor. The new parameter will be an int, and I will call it weapon location. To drive the value of the parameter we just created, we'll need to create states in a layer, but those states won't animate anything. Unity doesn't like states that does not contain an animation, so we will have to create a do nothing animation. It's quite easy. First, duplicate your avatar, Ctrl D, and create an empty object inside the clone. Now let's go to the animation tab, create a new animation with the clone selected of course, and call that animation idle. Let's animate the empty object we created. We can now delete the clone, and since our original avatar does not contain any default empty object, that animation will do nothing, but it still counts as an animation for Unity. Now that we have the idle animation, we can create the animation layer that will drive the location parameter. Let's name it Weapon Driver, and put its weight to 1. We will now drag our idle animation 5 times into that layer, or 4 if you don't want to use a role constraint. Very important, select all 2 states and uncheck by default. Be absolutely sure that it is unchecked for every single state we will create from now on, otherwise you will get weird results. We'll put the first one you dragged in aside, because we won't touch it anymore. The other ones, I usually arrange them around any state, so it looks prettier. We'll rename the one on top ip0, the one on the right, right 1, the one on the left, left 2, and if you have the one on the bottom, world 3. Before going further, and also because I forgot about it, let's create our weapon location parameter in the animator too. So go to the parameters tab, create a new int, name it exactly like the one you created in the expression parameters. And let's go back to our layer. To hip0, we will add a VRC avatar parameter driver, add a parameter, select our item location parameter, and put the value to 0, which is the default value. To right 1, we will do exactly the same thing, but with the value 1. And so on for the value 2 and 3. For the next part, which is creating the transitions, we need the parameters from our PhysBone and receivers. You just have to create them in the parameters tab. Pay attention, because they must be spelled exactly like what you wrote earlier. The exception being the PhysBone parameter, because you have to add underscore is grabbed at the end. All those parameters are booleans. Oh, and by the way, when I say exactly, it's exactly. This is case sensitive, so respect the capitals. Note that you have the parameters will create the transition from the any state to all of our drivers. Let's already create them, and for each of them, put transition duration to 0 and uncheck allow transition to self. We will now start with the hip transition. The logic here is quite easy to understand. An item should be in the hip if it is not grabbed and if it detects the hip. So the conditions will be grabbed, false, and hip, true. An item should be in the right hand if it is grabbed and if it detects the right hand. So grabbed to right hand true. Same logic for the left hand. For the world it's slightly different because of course the basic conditions will be grabbed false and hip false. But under certain circumstances it could create problems. So let's add a last condition, location not equals 0. That will prevent a direct transition between the hip and the world, which is not something you want. Note that our expression parameters are driven by the contacts. We can finally use them in what will be the very last step of this tutorial. Create a new layer, I'll call it weapon. Set its weight to 1. Drag and drop the idle animation as a default state, and then the 3 or 4 animations we created at the very beginning of the tutorial. So, hip weapon, weapon right, weapon left, and if you created it, weapon world. As usual, make sure that Y default has been checked everywhere. We'll put them around the any state, like in the previous layer, and create the transitions. As usual, set transition duration to 0 and uncheck allow transition to self. The conditions will be very simple. For the hip, item location equals 0. For the right hand, item location equals 1. For the left hand, item location equals 2. And for the world, item location equals 3. And we're done. We're finally done. Okay, time to build and test. So, as you can see, I can grab the item, leave it in the world, grab it with the other hand, and put it back on my hip. I hope this tutorial will help you. Have fun with your grabbable items. Oh, and maybe, but I say maybe because editing tools takes me a lot of time, but maybe I will write a tutorial to explain how to do that kind of cool control panel. See you!